On September 11th, I was actually a drill instructor at Paris Island, South Carolina. When we got the news of what happened, we were in the chow hall feeding our recruits. The news came out, everybody was kind of trying to figure out what was going on. You know, this is pre-social media. So everybody glommed into the chief cook's office, and he had a 13-inch black and white TV that we were all surrounding, trying to figure out the events of the day. We caught bits and pieces of some things unfolding. It wasn't until later on that evening where we got the full story about what happened.
I was actually on my non-flying tour in Miami, Florida. I was part of Marine Forces South Headquarters, which is the Marine component to U.S. Southern Command. And our intelligence guys always had a big screen with the news playing all the time at the headquarters. When the first plane hit the tower, the intel officer came running out and told us that the whole office kind of went silent. We all knew that it was no accident.
At the time, we lived in Mansfield, New Jersey, a small town outside of Hackettstown, New Jersey. And I was on my way to Jazzercise. We didn't realize the impact of it. We thought that it was just some kind of mistake with a small plane. About 5 minutes later, the person who uses the microphone and typically teaches a class got on the microphone and said, there's been a major catastrophe. Everybody needs to go home because they're probably sending our kids home from school. And they're saying it might be some sort of terrorist attack.
When we first got the news, we thought it was like everybody else, we thought it was a private plane that hit the towers. I don't want to say we were dismissive, but we were in the middle of training recruits and our schedule was intense. So I didn't really have a lot of time to think about it or process it. But it wasn't until later that night where I found out from my wife exactly what was going on.
A lot of us were aviators in that headquarters, and we knew that, number one, we're familiar with the airspace up there, we're familiar with the procedures, and we knew that for an airplane to hit one of those buildings, the only way they could do it would be if they were deliberate or if they happened to be struck by lightning or something and happened to fall on it. We knew it was deliberate, and we knew that there was more coming.
My husband worked for IBM at the time and traveled often, and he was on a plane that morning. My husband's itinerary was sitting on the dining room table, and he was booked for Flight 93. At the time, I didn't, they hadn't announced that plane yet. It was the last one to go down. It was 3:30 in the afternoon when my husband finally arrived home. I walked out into our garage, and my husband was a fairly large man. And he just, as he pulled in, he just slumped over the steering wheel and just sobbed. I just saw his body shaking. He was booked on Flight 93, and a coworker had called him at 11 p.m. the night before and convinced him to change his flight. And there's a good chance that seat was bought by one of the hijackers, because that's what they did. They, at the last minute, bought first class seats on direct flights. And the flight that he was moved to was sitting on the tarmac. They were 14th in line on the tarmac when they watched the second plane hit the second tower.
I had already put the recruits in the bed, and my wife calls me in the office, and she's like, "Hey, I got some good news and I got some bad news." She's like, "The good news is I just bought you a brand new truck. Look out the window." I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's awesome." The bad news is you're going to war. And then she explained to me all of the events and the timeline from beginning to end. That's when it hit me that I'm about to send these young men and women shortly after graduation off to war. It wasn't until the next day where we sat down with our recruits. In those few moments where we were explaining what the events of the previous day were and what happened, that's when we were realizing, hey, we've got young men and women in the platoons that we're training who are from New York. We had a recruit whose dad lost his father. He was a janitor, but there was a significant amount of recruits in our platoons that were directly impacted: fathers, brothers, uncles, next door neighbors. And one by one, we're trying to get them on the phone with anybody who would be able to provide any information about the status of their family.
The priorities immediately shifted to the war effort. People from our headquarters in particular occupations immediately get retasked with other jobs. And I was one of those. I was sent back to the F-18 training squadron on the West Coast so I could get refreshed and head back to a fighter squadron as soon as possible.
I stopped taking a lot of things for granted. In the U.S., we think that the wars and that all of that isn't going to come to us. We think it's all somewhere else. And some people believe we should go help somewhere else, and some people don't. But terrorism, on that day came to us, and there were 3,000 lives lost. We're not immune to what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think after 9/11, it humanized America a little more.
Prior to 9/11, we had a false sense of security. We thought we were untouchable. There is no mistake. We are the world's greatest military fighting force. No questions asked. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines at the time were the pinnacle of what a military structure and combat group should look like. But as a nation, as a standard civilian, I think that we had a false sense of security. And what was significant between the day before and the day after, that sense of security was gone. We thought we were invincible. We thought we were untouchable. And that clearly was not the case.
And we just wanted to go just hand it to them. Just really, tear the hide off them for what they'd done to us. And, it kind of goes back to, we fought a lot of wars where we weren't attacked. Well, we were attacked on this one. And so a lot of us, despite the sacrifice, were more than willing to just say, hey, when are we going? When can I go? How soon are we going to get there? Kind of thing. So it definitely changed the mindset. It was a new style of war fighting that we were not used to, because we were no longer, we always trained against a uniform threat, another country with a uniform military. And now you basically have a group of thugs that play your own rules against you, and they shoot at you and they blow things up while literally hiding behind kids and old ladies. And we had to figure out a way to, one, identify who the enemy was, and then fight them effectively while minimizing the civilian casualties. And that's a very hard balance to strike.
We're already training these young men and women and preparing them mentally, morally, ethically for combat. So in that regard, everything stayed the same.
I said spread it out right now. Spread it out! Spread it out!
What I will tell you is the volume got turned up a little bit. The intensity got turned up a little bit, because they weren't going to have that luxury of being in the Fleet Marine Force for a significant period of time before they were deployed to a combat environment.
Staff Sergeant Jonathan Clark grew up in Mount Juliet and Nashville. Like so many other drill instructors here, he knows everything has changed.
The drone starters and the recruits themselves know what they're getting into, and we know that we have to push ourselves and push the recruits just a little bit harder and a little bit farther to keep them going that extra distance, knowing that when they graduate now, things are going to be a little bit different had they graduated before September 11th.
Vast majority of them were ground combat, and shortly after graduation, they would go to their trade school, and then they would hit the Fleet Marine Force. We're talking 3 to 6 months at the most from the time they graduated to the time they were in Afghanistan. So I felt that it was my duty and my responsibility to crank up the volume a bit to make sure they were a bit more prepared than before the towers went down.
I think what it did was it made it clear that things like that didn't only happen to other countries. You know, it was like, oh, that's not going to happen here. That's going to happen over in, you know, Kenya or Lebanon or Israel, or, you know, it's never going to happen to us. And it made it clear that, yes, we were vulnerable. You know, we could experience these things, and it made us a lot more serious about how we looked at threats.
It was an atrocious day, and it took our community over a year to heal from the loss of lives and the impact that it had on our community. My best friend's husband tried to go back to work and ended up not being able to go back into the city for work. He just had a lot of post-traumatic, complications. I think it also made us have to, as a people, as a nation, be more empathetic to other nations. And recognize that, you know, we all need each other. Every nation, we all should be investing in supporting each other, and to value life. I feel like hopefully it made us as a nation value life more.
We learned a lot of lessons. I think in 20 years, we've forgotten a lot of those lessons. But I think we're getting reminded right now with what the Taliban is doing. Maybe we'll remember in time to fix it.
We made different decisions my husband made different decisions about work because he wanted us to move further south and get closer to our family. My brother now lives in Smyrna. My parents live here in Mount Juliet. It changed how we value living closer to family and, you know, making the most of, you know, milestones in life and those kinds of things. Instead of focusing more on making more money and like more substantial or prestigious career, we focused more on the value that, you know, being with family could add and the value of impacting the people around us. And,
you know, I still fly home to see my folks. And when I fly into Newark and I don't see the towers, it still bothers the heck out of me. It still hits me hard that they're not there anymore.